Welcome to learntotackle.com. If you are a rugby coach looking for a systematic grappling-based approach to safer, more effective rugby tackling, you came to the right place. In this video, I'm going to share with you some of the major lessons that I've accumulated over the last 20 years as a rugby athlete, a grappler, and as a strength coach operating at the highest levels of professional rugby. These lessons have been transformational in how I think about the tackle area in rugby, and my hope is that they're going to have a similar impact on you and your coaching. Let's begin. Firstly, who is this presentation for? As I said, rugby coaches, but let's go over some additional details. This presentation is going to be appropriate for both rugby union and rugby league coaches. While it's true that there are some nuances to rugby league that aren't covered in this presentation, specifically the ruck, there is huge carryover between the codes in the core skill of taking a resisting opponent down to the ground, namely tackling. Because the concepts underpinning tackling are universal, what we're going to talk about today is applicable to both men and women at all levels of the game. However, some of the materials, specifically periodization, will apply more to adult than youth athletes. Nonetheless, if you are a youth coach, you'll still be able to get a ton of value from the things that do apply to your setup, which is pretty much everything but that. The same is probably true if you're a player watching this rather than a coach. There's a lot in here that you're going to be able to benefit from, but in areas like periodization and session design, decision making is normally taken out of your hands and put into those of the coach. So unless you're putting this in front of your coaches, you don't want to worry too much about these areas. Lastly, this is not going to be an intro level presentation. I'm going to assume that you have a solid understanding of the game of rugby and its underlying concepts, and a decent amount of experience, if not as a coach, at the very least as a player. Let's get into it. Why does this presentation exist? Put simply, it exists because it's my sincere belief that the rugby culture as it pertains to tackling is failing our coaches and players. Because we're a collision-based and contact-based sport, and with the exception of touch and tag rugby, we're tackling pretty much from day one in our careers. We get lured into this false sense of security. We think that just because we've been doing it for a long time and we do it a lot, we figured it out. I would argue that the opposite is true. That a false sense of security has led us to neglect the tackle area. We just take it as a given that players understand how to tackle. We take it as a given that coaches know how to teach it. And if we just go through the motions without paying attention to the underlying concepts or processes, it will just take care of itself and we'll be able to tackle safely and effectively at a high level. I think that we don't know what we don't know. And the evidence is starting to mount up that there's work to be done on improving tackling in rugby. In fact, we're at a bit of a crossroads right now in our sport. As I record this, the governing bodies of rugby union are currently being sued by over 1,000 former players who are suffering in varying degrees from CTE, dementia, and motor neuron disease as a result of head trauma sustained in their careers. And I think at least part of this is attributable to how we've historically approached the tackle area in coaching and in training. If not for the moral duty to protect players, the several $100 million that they're being sued for could have a ruinous impact on a game that's already struggling financially. And the image of still relatively young former players suffering from memory loss, personality changes, and disability has had an understandably negative effect on youth participation in the game. So to the extent that we can do something about this problem, we should. So if, as we start to talk about this problem of tackling in rugby, the gears are starting to turn in your head and the problem seems like a daunting one, good, it should. The complex, chaotic nature of rugby means that effective tackling is a really difficult problem to solve. And this should be obvious when we take a second to think about it. Think about all the variables that change from tackle to tackle. Field position, body position, speed, angle, how many attacking players are in support, how many defensive players are in support, how long's left in the game, the weather, the tactics, and more. And the number of unique combinations that we can make up from those variables is simply astronomical. So how would we ever be adequately prepared for all those combinations when the extent of our tackling coaching most of the time is just hit them with your shoulder as hard as you can, keep your head out of the way so you don't get knocked out, squeeze your arms and drive your legs? And the obvious answer is, we're not going to be adequately prepared and we're going to run into problems. If anything, it should just confirm the need for a systems and principles-based approach to tackling that's going to be flexible and adaptable enough to work in that unpredictable environment, but still at the same time be simple enough that we can teach it to players and they can apply it in that chaos on the field. And we're going to need a change in mindset to get there. One of the more insightful things that my mentor said to me when I was coming up as a strength coach is your biggest strength always ends up becoming your biggest weakness. You lean on that strength so much that it leaves holes elsewhere. And our biggest strength as a sport in rugby is that we're tough and we prize intensity and aggression, because you can't play rugby for any appreciable amount of time and not possess those qualities. You simply get weeded out of the game. But that tendency to solve problems with more intensity and aggression becomes a crutch. When we find ourselves getting bumped, losing the physical battle, and missing tackles, we immediately try to solve the problem with more force and aggression. And while it's true that intensity does matter in rugby, intensity in the absence of technique or efficiency comes at a cost. We create more physical fatigue, more damage, and incur more risk than is necessary, all of which impairs performance in the short term and shortens careers in the long term. In the social media world, we get sucked into the idea of thinking that highlight reel tackles, where we destroy the other guy with huge amounts of force and aggression, is the goal. Counterintuitively, the best tackle to make is always the most boring, efficient, and unimpressive one that still gets the job done. Not only do you incur less damage and risk, those kinds of efforts are inherently more repeatable as you get deep into the game. And you're still going to have that aggression and intensity to add to technique in your back pocket if and when you need it. So I think there's a better way, and you might have already come to this conclusion yourself before watching this presentation, but I think that's actually only half the battle. Knowing how things should be done is one thing, but mapping out the process, breaking it down into chunks, and actually implementing change while juggling all of the other balls that rugby throws up is a much harder process. So my goal with this presentation is not only to show you a better way of doing things, but hopefully also to provide you with a framework to get there. I don't need to tell you how important the tackle area is to the game of rugby. Games and championships can sometimes hinge on single missed tackles. The physical and psychological edge that comes from tackle dominance is worth its weight in gold. And nor do I need to tell you about the outsized impact that the tackle has on player health and availability. The tackle accounts for 50% of all injuries in rugby and nearly 3/4 of all concussions. Poor technique in the tackle area is less akin to a small leak in the boat. It's more like a gaping hole in the side that threatens to sink the ship. That's before we discuss the potential lifelong consequences of head impacts on health and longevity post-retirement. So in fixing our tackling, we're not just serving our athletes with more wins on the field, which is a noble goal in and of itself, but we're also potentially adding years to their career and much needed quality to their life when they're done with the game. That's the potential impact of an effective tackling system, and that's what I hope to start you out on the road to by watching this presentation. While the status quo of rugby tackling may be broken, it's my belief that there's a better way, and that way is centered around applying the mechanical principles of grappling. It's a group of sports with literally thousands of years of experimentation, tens of millions of athletes, and extremely high-level Olympic competition to weed out the bad ideas. They've been exclusively thinking about this problem for a lot longer than we have in rugby, and I think they're a lot closer to the right answers than we are. So by the end of this presentation, you'll have a basic understanding of the mechanics of tackling, how to structure the learning environment so that your tackle training actually transfers to the rugby field, and how to progress training throughout the year to maximize performance while still maintaining health and availability. Today is going to be an introduction, and you're going to get a ton of value from this presentation, but if you really want to go down the rabbit hole and have it all laid out for you, you can visit learntotackle.com for more information on our long form course. Hopefully you're ready and excited to get into the presentation, but if you're not though, you're still on the fence and you're wondering why you should even listen to me, well, briefly putting aside humility, I'll give you a quick breakdown of my bio. They say that those who can do and those who can't coach. Well, I was a terrible athlete, so that actually made me a pretty good coach. I'm a career strength and conditioning coach who's worked in 5 different countries for a host of different elite level sporting organizations, including Argentina Rugby, Sydney Roosters, London Wasps, in addition to a number of Division 1 institutions in American college football. I've been training jiu-jitsu for almost the last decade, so in addition to my 20 years of involvement in rugby, I've got a few thousand hours of time on the mats, of which takedowns and tackling is a massive part. In terms of my qualifications, I've got 2 performance degrees in the usual alphabet soup after my name. I've presented at conferences and professional sports teams all over the world, including the NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, Premier League Soccer, Argentinian soccer, and more. I also built and sold Strength Coach Network, which is a coach education website. So I literally made my living trying to condense large amounts of information down into bite-sized chunks and delivering them in a digestible format to coaches so they can use them in the real world. It's not an exaggeration to say that I've been thinking about tackling in one form or another for decades. I first picked up a rugby ball in 1997 and I played continuously until I transitioned to jiu-jitsu in 2016. And I've been hooked on grappling ever since. And to this day, years after my career, I can recall tackle performances that stick in my mind. For my own playing days, that's mostly examples about when I shit the bed and missed tackles that I should have made. It bugs me to this day, and I'm still mentally going over ways that I could have fixed it. From players that I've coached and worked alongside, I think about guys like Nico Sanchez, who, despite being 85 kilos and everyone running down his channel because they thought he was a soft touch, he topped the tackle count with Richie McCaw the first year that Argentina were in the Rugby Championship. I think about guys like Serge Betson, who despite being 35 and at the very end of his career when he was at Wasps, was still able to put in man of the match performances as a back row. And on the flip side, I remember seeing guys who were physical freaks in the gym, but who never seemed quite able to transfer it to the field. And at the time, I remember thinking about that, trying to explain mentally why I was seeing what I was seeing so that I could try to do something about it. And the penny started to drop for me when I got my first exposure to formalized grappling training in rugby when I worked for the Sydney Roosters in the NRL. Twice a week, every week in the preseason, our guys would train with a guy named Larry Papadopoulos, who's an MMA pioneer and a BJJ and judo black belt. So I watched the sessions, took it all in, tried them out for myself, asked Larry a bunch of questions, and it was that experience that was a trigger for me to start grappling seriously myself. Now, it wasn't until I coached in Japan and I realized I hadn't played a game in a year and I'd accidentally retired from rugby that it was time to fill the gap. That was when I started to train jiu-jitsu. And like all religious converts, I jumped in with both feet and soon became obsessed, training more and more each week. And I also started to compete. So I moved to the States in 2018. I kept training and I kept competing. And it was here that I had a particularly painful reality check. I'd drawn a former Division I college wrestler in competition. And to say that this dude ragdolled me is an understatement. I could not do anything to take him down. He took me down at will, controlled me like a child on the floor, and I also have a vivid memory of him fireman's tossing me. And it was at the exact moment that I was upside down in midair that I realized I needed to get a lot better at wrestling. That humiliation was the impetus for me to start attending the wrestling and judo specific classes at my gym, to seek out training partners with backgrounds in stand-up like judo, freestyle, folk style wrestling, and to try to stand up with them. And it was a humbling experience, despite at that point almost 20 years of experience of tackling people in rugby, lifting weights, being decently strong, and trying to be aggressive. These people shut me down. Not only couldn't I take them down, I could barely get my hands around them or lift one of their legs off the floor. And they, on the other hand, were able to take me down while expending a fraction of the same effort and intensity. And by the end of every round, I would be in a pile on the floor, absolutely spent, and they would be chilling. And it's these experiences that forced me to realize I really didn't know what I didn't know, and I still had a lot of learning to do. As a coach, I've always been a firm believer in the philosophy that success and failure are the most powerful teachers we have. And I have had a lot of lessons in the form of the latter in the nearly 8 years since I took that ride upside down in competition. I've been fortunate enough to train grappling in England, Thailand, Japan, America, the Philippines, and Argentina, and learned from some truly excellent coaches. I've trained with and against some world championship level athletes, including a particularly harrowing session against a Greco-Roman wrestling world champion. And over the course of getting taken down probably thousands of times in those intervening 8 years, each of them has taught me something. And I've also had the benefit to sit down with them and pick their brains after the fact. I've also gone down the rabbit hole of film study, buying instructionals from famous coaches, watching performances from some of the best wrestlers, judokas, and jiu-jitsu athletes on earth. And these combined experiences have taught me one thing, which brings to mind the Miyamoto Musashi quote, which is, if you know the way broadly, you'll see it in everything. Eventually, I came to the realization that all takedowns, regardless of sport, regardless of technique, regardless of any other set of variables, adhere to a common set of principles that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And that realization has been central to my subsequent development as a grappler and as a coach. By keeping those principles, that end goal in mind, I've been able to simplify things when I grapple. No matter what weird or novel situation I find myself in, by keeping that end goal in mind, I can work backwards to try to find a solution. It's helped me to have more confidence in my ability to stand up with and take down progressively better grapplers. Ironically, though, the more I know, the more I realize what I don't know. Now, almost 10 years into jiu-jitsu, I think I'm just at the tip of the iceberg and there's so much more to learn. And I hope that my body holds out long enough for me to start to get there. So that grappling journey has been an extremely fun and stimulating one for me, but almost bittersweet in a way, because the lessons that I've learned have come after I've stepped away from playing rugby and full-time coaching. I wish I knew then what I know now. I would have been that much more effective as a player, but more importantly, I think it would have taken my coaching to the next level in terms of my ability to enhance the performance of my athletes and to keep them safe when tackling. Even now, almost 30 years after first picking up a rugby ball, I'm seeing the game with fresh eyes. I see great examples of players applying the principles of effective grappling on the field, but more importantly, I also see a lot of potential areas for improvement in both training and competition. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there that with some small changes could have outsized effects in terms of performance and longevity, and that's what I hope to provide you with within this presentation. So enough teasing, here's the good stuff. All takedowns, all tackles are a product of instability. Look at the most stable structures on Earth, like the pyramids. Heavy, big footprint, low center of mass, and it resides well within the base of support. Look at stable athletes who are hard to take down. They tend to be heavier, have a wide base, a low center of mass, and that center of mass resides well within the base of support. How would we make a building unstable? Say like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. We'd make it lighter, give it a smaller footprint, raise its center of mass, and then push that center of mass progressively further outside the base of support until it toppled over. How do you make an athlete unstable? Well, you can't make them lighter. They're going to weigh what they're going to weigh, but you can definitely narrow their base of support. You can raise their center of mass, and then you can push it progressively further outside the base of support until they hit the deck. What does that look like in the real world? Well, firstly, you can't take down what you're not touching, so you need to get close enough to put your hands on the other guy. This is called penetration. Next, you need to get connected to them. The stronger the connection, the better. Ideally with your arms all the way around some part of their body so that they can't break that connection. You're then going to use that connection to get your center of mass as close to theirs as possible within the context of whatever technique that you're doing, because that's going to maximize your leverage. To illustrate this, think about the difference between pressing a bar directly overhead versus raising it away from your body with straight arms. Once you've got that connection, now you need leverage. You can be as connected as you like, but if their center of mass is still within their base of support, they're going to remain upright. And it's not until you disrupt that center of mass by pushing it outside their base of support that you're going to create enough instability to topple their structure. Unfortunately for us, human beings are not buildings. Buildings don't fight back, and humans do. So they're going to fight back to maintain their stability by doing the exact opposite of what it is you're trying to accomplish. They're going to increase their base of support, they're going to lower their center of mass, and they're going to rebase to better maintain that center within their base. So you need to stop them doing that, either by moving their center of mass somewhere that they can't maintain their base of support, or by physically blocking them somewhere that they can. That's it. That's the essence of takedowns. You will not find a takedown in any grappling discipline that does not obey these principles, and rugby tackling is no different. It obeys the same mechanical rules, and the more we respect and train according to these principles in rugby, the more effective tacklers we're going to be. That's the what, but now let's discuss the how. I mentioned to you before, in rugby we prize aggression, force, and intensity to a fault. And I was not at all immune to that as a player or even for large portions of my coaching career, and that's for good reason. Rugby is an attritional game. Physical contact and tackling is psychologically intimidating, and timid rugby players tend to get hurt and lose games. There's a ton of truth to the cliche that games are won off the field before the whistle ever blows, in the mind first. And it's a collision-based game. Physics matter. The bigger you are, the more force and speed you carry into a collision, the greater your momentum is going to be, and the more effective you're going to be carrying the ball and tackling. But guess what? The other guys lift weights. They're also big. They also run hard and straight. They're just as aggressive. So it's basically a wash, which begs the question, then what? Well, for big chunks of my career, the answer was just more aggression, more force. I was like a man with a hammer looking for nails. But as my career progressed, I kept getting confronted with examples that there was a better way. At the time, one of the least successful teams that I worked with were actually the most aggressive. Guys would get so hyped and passionate before a game, they'd be in tears. And then we'd go out and get destroyed. And it took us a long time to turn that corner. Conversely, the most successful team that I worked with were the most detached. Pre-game and at halftime, everyone sat down and calmly talked at regular speaking volume about the technical aspects of what needed to be done. That was the same team where a senior coach had said that the best tackle to make was the most boring one. This was coming from a guy who had played 300 professional games, won literally everything in the game as a player, and who'd won titles to match as a coach. That's quite a shock to the system when you've been raised to believe that you have to go as hard as you can in every single tackle. But with the benefit of hindsight, he was absolutely right. What years of grappling and studying elite level wrestlers, judokas, and jiu-jitsu and MMA athletes has taught me is that elite level performance is characterized by control and technique much more so than it is blind aggression. The more you force it, the more you try to solve the problem with more aggression, the worse you tend to do, and the sooner you tend to gas out, which the other guy can capitalize on. In fact, studying elite level combat athletes taught me how wrong we've been doing in rugby. In combat sports, no matter what level you're at, you drill. Every day, you practice the skills that underpin your sport under easy conditions first, then under progressively more difficult conditions until you're doing it for real under regular, intense conditions. And if and when you can't perform a skill, you stop, go back a step, and keep working under those easier conditions until you've nailed it. At no point do you jump straight to the most difficult version of the skill, or even practice parts of the skill with immediate, full intensity. But that's exactly what we do in rugby. Most of the tackling we do in rugby training is live against a fully resisting ball carrier. Train like you play is the theory. And if we're not doing that, we're hitting tackle bags or shields at full tilt. But how many tackles in rugby are missed or broken because the other guy fought back after the initial hit? Probably most of them. What happens after the initial contact is just as important as the initial contact itself. You know what doesn't fight back? Tackle bags and guys holding shields. So our tackle practice in rugby is almost exclusively either too intense or too lacking in realism to meaningfully develop the skill. And don't think that just because you or your players understand what good tackling looks like, that you're automatically going to be able to replicate it on the field. Grappling has taught me that effective takedowns and tackling is about feel, where the other guy's weight is, where they're pushing, where they're stable, where they're unstable. And you can't read or watch your way to that feeling. You have to do it. You have to experience it. You have to get wet if you want to learn how to swim. The truth is that tackling, despite its attritional nature, is like any other skill. When you're first learning to read, you take your time, break words down into chunks, sound them out, and then gradually speed things up and read more and more difficult books. When you learn the piano, you don't just attempt to play the most difficult piece you can at full speed. You start slowly, learning the chunks as you go, and you pay extra attention to the most difficult parts before you join all those bits together and attempt it as a whole. At no point when you're learning to read and you make mistakes do you try to psych yourself up and read more aggressively. At no point when you're struggling with a piece on the piano do you just keep playing the piece in its entirety all the way through until you get it. So why do we take this approach with tackling? Once I personally let go of the traditional approach to teaching tackling is when things started to click for me. I slowed things down. I broke skills into chunks. I got familiar with the positions and the feels of each stage. Then I pieced them together into a whole. And at each stage, my goal was to accumulate successful reps before I could earn the right to perform higher intensity variations of the skill. I also got rid of the bags and the shields when learning tackle skills, live partners only. Yes, they're useful for protecting you when you want to practice something as simple as coordination or hitting hard without paying such a high mechanical cost. But they don't teach you any of the skill of responding to a resisting human being who's going to fight you back. And that's the essence of tackling skill. You cannot master an environment that you've not inhabited. Expecting bag hits to prepare you for the reality of rugby tackling is like expecting hitting a heavy bag to prepare you for a 12-round boxing match. Rather, my approach now is to use competition and drills with clear criteria for success and failure to teach me. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how pretty it looks if you still lose. Winning is what matters on the field, and we want to learn how to win through our tackle practice. My approach to tackling today is night and day compared to what I learned when I was a player or even when I worked as a strength coach in the pros. We don't just tackle for the last few weeks of the season and hope for the best. Rather, we dedicate ourselves year-round to the purposeful practice of tackling. Sometimes we do part of the skill, sometimes we do the whole skill. Sometimes we go hard, sometimes we go easy. But we're thinking about and practicing tackling in some form every single week of the year. I also got rid of the massive jump that traditionally occurs between bag hits, which are easy, and tackling in the chaos of live rugby, which is probably the hardest form of tackling you can perform. Rather, there's a clear, logical, step-by-step progression through progressively more intense variation of the skill to bridge the easiest with the hardest stuff that we do. And we respect the order of technique before intensity. Skill execution has to look good at slow speed with easy decision making and low contact demands before we earn the right to turn the dial. Aggression will always be there, but we can't use aggression to channel a skill that doesn't exist or doesn't hold up under the stresses of intense competition. How do we earn that right? The most fundamental question we need to ask ourselves when it comes to tackling is, do you have the strength and control to maneuver your own body in space through all ranges and planes of movement? And if not, what makes you think you can do it carrying somebody else's body weight? Once you've done that, you need to be able to demonstrate that you can successfully perform the skill of tackling in its easiest conditions. Then, under realistic, typical case conditions, and then finally under the worst case imaginable conditions. If you can check all those boxes in training by the time the season comes around, you're going to be robust to whatever it is the season throws at you. After that, it's just a case of letting the games stress the skills, then keeping them sharp and tweaking in training. So we've talked about the how and the what. Let's now talk about how to organize everything together. Let me share with you how I used to organize my training throughout the year and see if you can relate. Off season, almost nothing but lifting. Rugby's a strength and power sport. We need to be big and strong, so we need to lift 4 or 5 days a week while we have the chance, right? Then preseason rolls around, and rugby's also played in the feet and it requires a lot of conditioning, so we need to start playing touch and running intervals to get fit. Halfway through preseason, we start panicking, thinking about friendlies and the start of the season. So that's when we start playing contact rugby and throwing in the tackle bags and shields and the down-ups. And then once the season arrives, because we're so beat up from the games, we tend to get rid of the contact in training and we just cross our fingers and hope that our tackle skills stay sharp. Maybe we'll throw in some bag hits on a Tuesday, but that's about it. I bet your training probably looks something like that right now. I know of professional teams where the training looks like that right now, and I think we can do a lot better. Does this also sound familiar? Every single time you switch from mostly lifting to mostly running to mostly rugby, guys get hurt. Maybe the first week or so goes well because the adrenaline's high, you're enjoying training, but eventually the soreness and the fatigue starts to creep in. You drag through sessions and then something breaks. And once you're hurt, the training keeps going on without you. The team keeps progressing. And when you come back, you're a step off the pace. And that's a gap that you never make up before the season arrives. Now, despite all the previous enthusiasm, you start the season slow and underperforming. Your body's in bits after the first couple of games because you've not come close to the demands of a game during preseason. In the unlikely event that hasn't happened to you personally, I guarantee it's happened to a teammate of yours. And the reason why is simple, because most athletes, most of the time, are unprepared for the demands of the game. Do you know the demands of the game? Do you know in advance how many tackles you're going to have to be able to make in a typical game? What about the worst case scenario? And do you want the first time you feel the intensity of that worst case scenario to be in the middle of a game? Or would you prefer to taste it once in preseason to know that you're ready and that you can go into the season with confidence? Almost nobody in rugby can answer those questions, and almost nobody has a plan to get there, and it shows in their injury stats and their early performances. What my career as a strength coach taught me is that all injuries have a physical basis. If you ask the body to do more than it's physically prepared to do, sooner or later, it's going to break. It isn't high intensity or high workloads that break the body necessarily, but how we get there. If we take a long-term approach with sensible week-to-week progressions in intensity and volume, we'll give the body plenty of opportunity to recover and adapt. And even if we slow cook training, we'll be able to exceed the worst-case scenario of game demands before the season arrives, so that the season is almost a deload and we go into the season fresh and fast. And truthfully, you can't hit those kind of worst case scenario numbers with just a few weeks training. It's like trying to take an entire course of antibiotics in a single day. So not only for the skill's sake, but also for physical reasons, we need to commit to tackling being a year-round activity with dedicated practice being performed every single week. My approach now is to train everything year-round. The key caveat though is manipulating the kinds of activities and loading parameters that we expose ourselves to ensure that we're only stressing close to rather than past the physical limits of the body. We want to bend but not break. Then we adapt, get more robust and resilient, and then we can crank up the heat a little bit more next week. At all times throughout the preparatory period, we're constantly working backwards from the end in mind. What are the hardest conditions that we're likely to be exposed to in the forthcoming season? Physically, tactically, technically, and psychologically. And do we have smart progressions in place to meet those demands for all the major high intensity actions of the sport before the season arrives? Sprinting, changing direction, rucking, mauling, scrummaging, and the topic for today, tackling. If we can answer those questions and hit those numbers and get there in a smart way, I think we're doing a pretty good job in terms of our training. How does that look in real life? I would say divide your year into clear, distinct blocks. I go for off-season, early preseason, mid-preseason, friendly games, and the in-season. Define ahead of time what sort of activities and training drills you're going to focus on in each block. There should be a clear progression in intensity and skill difficulty as the season approaches. Set yourself volume and intensity guidelines for each block. There should be a clear, logical progression throughout each. Each time you start a new block, it will act as a mini deload. And keep an eye on those worst case scenario tackle numbers that you need to hit before the season arrives. I recommend that you hit them at or around the time that the friendly games arrive so that you have around a 1 to 2 week period to freshen up and correct any errors before the season arrives. In summary, I think the most effective recipe for rugby tackling is a grappling-based approach, paired with executing those skills in a progressively more stressful and realistic learning environment. It has to be trained year-round and loaded in a fashion that eventually exceeds typical game demands, meets the worst-case scenario demands, and you do all of that before the season arrives. Simple to do, but not easy. It actually requires a lot of threads to be pulled together into one coherent program, including not just knowledge of rugby, but also knowledge and experience of grappling, detailed understanding of motor learning, knowledge of game demands and how to extract those demands from the literature, and the ability to intelligently program both the training week and the sessions contained within that training week, while juggling all of the other things that rugby throws up, including, but not limited to, individual and unit skills, team tactics, and physical prep. If that sounds hard, it is. And that's why I think it took me 20 years to feel like I have a decent solution to these problems. My guess is not everyone wants to spend the amount of time or money that I invested in getting to this point, and that's why I created Learn to Tackle. It's a long-form, 10-hour course that lays out my entire approach to tackling for rugby, and I want to spend the next few minutes telling you all about it. The course is comprised of 10 modules that average about an hour each that will walk you through the entire process, from research to theory to practice to implementation and beyond. By the end of this course, you'll be able to implement the grappling-based approach to rugby tackling and have your entire next year of tackle training mapped out for you and your athletes, including drill selection, loading parameters, and how to implement and adjust the plan as the season unfolds. This includes videos of all the exercises and drills discussed, and diagrams to show you how to set up and manage all of the training exercises. Don't think of this course as just a list of exercises or recipes with no explanation. Rather, think of it as learning how to cook, how to select the ingredients, the technique of preparing them, then how to combine them into a meal that works. That's ultimately much more powerful and valuable than a recipe book. And that's the approach that we're going to take to rugby tackling in this course. Socrates says that wisdom lies in the definition of terms, and that's why we're going to begin Module 1 by defining exactly what a tackle is within the laws of rugby, and what sort of tackling benchmarks we need to hit at the elite level of rugby union to be considered effective tacklers. This is going to provide us with the endpoint or destination that we're then going to work backwards from to achieve in our training. We're also going to consult the scientific literature to see the impact of various tackle variables on match performance and injury risk, in addition to the effectiveness of targeted training interventions on tackle performance. In Module 2, we're going to take a deep dive into the world of grappling. As we'll discuss, there are certain techniques or principles that appear to be common to practically every grappling sport on Earth, despite massive differences in geography, time, rule sets, and clothing. That group of techniques is probably the stuff that is most going to survive the jump to being applied to rugby. So we're going to spend an entire module going through a step-by-step analysis of each of these techniques, discussing how and why they work, and how they can most appropriately be applied to rugby. In Module 3, we're going to bridge the gap between the mats and the field by analysing film to show how the principles of effective grappling are displayed by elite-level rugby athletes. And we're going to introduce the P framework. This is a useful mental model that's going to provide us with the language to precisely define and describe tackle performance in both time and space, and that in turn is going to lay the table for effective communication in coaching. In Module 4, we'll discuss the science of coaching and skill acquisition. Specifically, how do we learn and control movement as athletes? What variables affect skill performance? And how can we as coaches manipulate these variables to accelerate athlete learning and make sure that skills are both adaptable and robust enough to hold up under the intense demands of rugby competition? We'll also introduce the concept of the performance pyramid. This is the classification of training activities into distinct blocks, and we're going to talk about how these should be ordered throughout the athlete's career and preparatory period to ensure robust, stable tackle performance. Module 5 is where we'll begin to talk about the drills and training activities themselves. The bottom layer of the performance pyramid is the pre-contact phase. The goal of this phase is to become a master of your own body weight in space, to lay the necessary foundation to earn the right to start tackling and controlling somebody else's body weight. This is achieved through solo calisthenic locomotion and tumbling drills, the introduction of partner strength and carry drills, and will also begin to expose athletes to contact in the form of lower impact games that implicitly teach and reinforce the principles of effective grappling that we talked about in Module 2. Videos are included for all of these activities. Module 6 is dedicated to the core tackling skills where we're making connection with either the lower, middle, or upper portion of the ball carrier's body. For each tackle type, we'll discuss the relative strengths and weaknesses, in which rugby scenarios they're most likely to be used effectively, and the various ways that each tackle type can be finished according to how the ball carrier fights back. We're going to round out each of these techniques with a detailed part-to-whole progression that works backwards from the finish to performing the skill in its entirety under simple, unresisted conditions. We'll also provide general practice guidelines on how to progress each skill, while providing the necessary balance between consistency and repetition to hone the skill, with the need for variety and exploration to reflect the highly varied nature of rugby itself. Module 7 adheres to the same structure as Module 6, but pertains to snap-down tackles and hand fighting. We can think of snap-downs as the break glass in case of emergency option when it's not possible to get connected to make a more traditional level 1 through 3 tackle. Not ideal, but it's absolutely going to happen in the game, so we need to prepare for it. Hand fighting, while not a tackle skill in itself, still has big implications for success in the tackle area. The opposition gets a vote, and a major strategy to prevent the strong connection needed to make an effective tackle is to use fens or handoffs to create a physical barrier between ball carrier and tackler. Our section on hand fighting discusses the most effective ways to combat this while integrating these techniques into the wider tackling action. Module 8 is dedicated to the top 3 layers of the performance pyramid. Once the foundation has been laid with pre-contact work and athletes have demonstrated competency performing the core skills of tackling under simple conditions, it's time to turn up the intensity in the form of live, resisted 1v1s, then 2v1s, and finally 3v2s. To that end, we'll be discussing about how to manipulate practice variables to elicit the various techniques we discuss in Modules 6 and 7, in addition to the mechanical principles and practical considerations of gang tackles, which will need to be factored into the top 2 layers of the performance pyramid. This module includes live video footage of these drills being coached to real athletes in the real world, not the typical sterile 100% perfect reps that look nothing like the reality of coaching. In Module 9, we'll start to bring all the threads together. We'll put hard numbers to the techniques and progressions that we've talked about in all the modules thus far, providing a clear roadmap to safely work up to the worst case scenarios that we need to be prepared for in the season. We'll talk about how to divide the annual calendar into distinct phases that work with the traditional rugby calendar, including which activities should be performed and when. We're also going to provide sample outlines for training weeks and sample sessions for each phase to show how tackle training fits into the broader context of the training week and how global training stress should be managed from day to day. Module 10. The proverb says that man makes plans and God laughs. So the final module of this course is going to be dedicated to what you do once you've started to implement your plan in the real world and the cracks start to appear. You're going to need an analytical framework to be able to track tackle performance over time, identify potential areas of weakness, devise targeted interventions to address them, and then assess the effectiveness of those interventions. So there it is. I'm biased, but I really do think this is the most comprehensive resource for rugby tackling available on the internet. Everything is laid out for you, but at the same time, it's not a paint-by-numbers program that you just want to blindly follow along to. Rather, it's going to teach you how to think and how to coach your own sessions so that you can deliver to your players exactly what they need when they need it, rather than an ill-fitting cookie-cutter program that might not fit the constraints that you're working under. My goal is that this is the last tackling course you ever buy, because the principles and concepts that we talk about in these modules are so useful that they set you up for the rest of your career. And after that, it's just a case of building upon that base with tweaks and learning into the future. To give you an idea of the amount of work that's gone into this course, it's the product of several thousand hours of research, training, reflecting, and refining to condense all those ideas down into the 10 hours that comprise this course. Between the money I've spent on grappling and the 2 performance degrees, I dread to think how much I've spent getting to this point. But just for this course, I've spent the last half a year and several $1,000s of expenses just filming and producing the materials. But that's for a good reason. I didn't want to rush to put out these materials. I've sat on this for a long time, and it's actually been a number of years until I felt that I had the requisite knowledge and the experience across all of the disciplines that we've talked about, that I felt like I was ready to package them into a system that's comprehensive enough to reflect the demands of rugby, but also simple enough that can be useful to coaches at every level of the game, from test international teams all the way down to amateur coaches. And I've been in consultation with a number of professional rugby coaches and players, some of which include high-level internationals, throughout the creation of this course. And so far, the feedback has been super encouraging. So I hope that upon taking this course, you feel the same way. So I hope by now I've piqued your interest enough that you want to take the course. You're probably wondering how much it is. It's going to be priced at $299.99. Why so much? Well, one, because of the quality of the material and the information that you're going to get access to inside of the course. But the really big reason is you're saving time. When you pay for education, you're paying for speed. I am not remotely special or unique. If you wanted to, you could acquire the same knowledge, experience, and skills as I have. But my guess is you're way too busy and juggling way too many other responsibilities as a coach to even want to do that. You want actionable information and results now. So let me save you the time. How much time? Well, if we put aside the 25 years of training for rugby, the higher education, the thousands of hours of time on the mat, how long would it take you to sift through all of the research and reading that went into just this course? I can tell you it personally took me a 40-hour week. Likewise for the film study, that's another 40 hours. Add another 40 hours on top of that to build out all of the schedules and the session plan. So that alone is 120 hours of work that I've saved you. The true figure is probably a lot more than that. And at a cost of $299.99, you're paying just $2.50 for every hour of time that I've saved you. Is your time as a coach worth more than $2.50 an hour? I sincerely hope so. That's the good reason why you want to invest in this course. I've personally paid upwards of $200 for just straight instructionals that demonstrate grappling drills and techniques. I've paid the same for coaching resources that delve more into the actual teaching and educational frameworks rather than the materials. And I've paid about the same for annual training plans that lay everything out for me in various sports. Each of these things is valuable in and of themselves, and you can probably pick up the separate pieces of the materials contained within this course elsewhere on the internet. But I believe that the most optimal approach to tackling is one that combines all three. Technique without a plan is directionless. Concepts and principles without actual training is impractical. And sessions aren't truly effective until they're combined into a meaningful plan that evolves over time. The sum of the whole truly is greater than the parts, and you can get your hands on all of them inside this course for much less than you pay to assemble them in their disparate parts elsewhere on the internet. But if you're still on the fence and you're not sure if this course is worth your time and money, we have a money back guarantee. If at any time in the first 72 hours after signing up for the course, you feel like it's not great value for money, we'll refund everything you paid, no questions asked. So what will it be? Continue with the status quo? Keep coaching that traditional, head on the outside, hit them as hard as you can, and drive your legs? Or are you ready to level up and adopt a comprehensive approach to tackling, with science, practice, and thousands of years of grappling wisdom behind it? Will you be a man with a hammer looking for nails to hit no matter what? Or will you be a craftsman with a toolbox of diverse tackling tools, confident that no matter what problem you're faced with, you have the tools for the job? I hope it's the latter, and if so, I'll see you on the inside. Thanks.